Jake Thompson had always dreamed of owning his own piece of land. Growing up in a cramped apartment with 3 siblings, he promised himself that one day he would have space to breathe, space to call truly his own. After 8 years in the Army, that dream finally became reality when he bought 2 beautiful acres in Willowbrook Estates. The property was everything he had imagined. Tall oak trees lined the back edge, and a small creek ran through the corner, creating the perfect spot where he planned to build a deck someday. The land sat at the very edge of the fancy neighborhood, giving him privacy while still being part of something nice. His neighbors seemed friendly enough, though he didn't see them much with his busy schedule at the base. Jake had big plans for this land. He spent hours sketching out ideas for his future home. Nothing too fancy, just a simple 3-bedroom house with a big garage where he could work on his motorcycle. Maybe a small workshop in the back where he could build furniture like his grandfather used to do. He even picked out the exact spot where he wanted to plant a vegetable garden, remembering how his mom always said store-bought tomatoes never tasted as good as homegrown ones. But those plans would have to wait. Jake's unit was being deployed to Afghanistan for what his commanding officer said would be a 12-month tour. The timing wasn't perfect, but Jake was a soldier first. He knew his duty came before his personal dreams, even if it meant putting his house plans on hold for another year. Before leaving, Jake made sure everything was perfectly organized. He wasn't the type to leave loose ends. His mortgage payments were set up to come out of his bank account automatically every month. His property taxes were current, and he had even paid 6 months ahead just to be safe. He gave his lawyer, Mr. Peterson, power of attorney to handle any issues that might come up while he was gone. Jake also made sure his mail would be forwarded to his parents' house in Ohio. His mom promised to keep an eye on any important documents and let him know if anything needed his attention. She was good about that kind of thing. Probably too good, actually. She would email him about every piece of junk mail that showed up. The neighborhood seemed quiet and well-maintained when he left. The houses were all neat and tidy, with perfectly trimmed lawns and flowers planted in straight rows. It was the kind of place where people took pride in their properties. Jake felt good knowing his land was in a safe area where property values would probably keep going up while he was away. His deployment started like most others. Long days, difficult conditions, but good people around him. Jake kept busy with his responsibilities, but in his quiet moments he would think about his land back home. Sometimes he would pull up the pictures on his phone, the ones he took the day he signed the papers. There was something comforting about knowing that no matter what happened over here, he had something solid waiting for him back in the States. The months passed slowly. Jake stayed in touch with his family through video calls when internet was available. His mom would update him on neighborhood news she heard from his dad, who sometimes drove by the property just to check on things. Everything seemed normal. The grass was growing a bit wild, but that was expected. Jake actually liked the idea of it looking a little natural rather than perfectly manicured like some of the other yards in the area. It was month 11 when everything changed. Jake was sitting in the mess hall checking his email on his tablet when he saw a message from Danny, the guy who lived in the house closest to his property. The subject line made his stomach drop. "You need to see this. Urgent." Danny wasn't the type to exaggerate or send dramatic messages. He was a quiet accountant who mostly kept to himself but had always been friendly to Jake. His email was short but alarming. "Jake, I don't know how to tell you this, but there are construction crews working on your land. They've been there for 3 days now. I tried to talk to them, but they said they bought the property legally. I took some pictures. You need to call someone right away." The photos that followed made Jake's blood run cold. His beautiful oak trees were gone, cut down and hauled away like they were nothing more than obstacles. The little creek was being filled in with dirt and gravel. Heavy machinery sat where he had planned to build his workshop. And worst of all, there was already a concrete foundation poured where his house was supposed to go. Jake stared at the pictures for a long time, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the construction crew was on the wrong lot. Maybe Danny was confused about which property was his. But deep down, Jake knew something was terribly wrong. His hands were shaking as he called Mr. Peterson's office using the satellite phone. It was the middle of the night back home, but this couldn't wait. When he finally reached his lawyer the next morning, the news was even worse than he had feared. "Jake, I don't know how to tell you this," Mr. Peterson said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "According to the county records, your property was sold 3 weeks ago for unpaid homeowner association fees. The sale was completely legal according to the paperwork I'm looking at." "What homeowner association fees?" Jake asked, feeling like the ground was shifting under his feet. "I never joined any homeowner association. I never got any bills or notices about fees." Mr. Peterson explained what he had discovered. Apparently, the Willowbrook Estates HOA claimed that Jake owed $847 in fees that had been accumulating since he bought the property. They said they had sent multiple notices to his address, and when he didn't respond or pay, they had the legal right to foreclose on his property. The land had been sold at a foreclosure auction to something called Pinnacle Development Corporation for $89,000, less than half of what Jake had paid for it, and way less than what it was worth now. The sale had happened so fast that by the time anyone noticed, it was already done. "But I was deployed," Jake said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I'm active duty military. There are laws that protect service members from this kind of thing." "There are," Mr. Peterson agreed, "and that's what makes this so strange. Someone should have verified your military status before proceeding with any foreclosure. The fact that they didn't suggests either incompetence or something more deliberate." Jake felt sick. Everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed about, was being destroyed while he was thousands of miles away serving his country. The company that bought his land was already building something on it, and they claimed they had purchased it in good faith. Getting it back was going to be a legal nightmare, if it was even possible at all. As he sat in his small room at the forward operating base, looking at pictures of strangers tearing apart his future, Jake realized this wasn't just about money or property. This was about something much bigger. Someone had targeted him specifically because he was deployed and couldn't defend himself. Someone had taken advantage of his service to his country to steal his dreams. But Jake was a soldier, and soldiers don't give up without a fight. This was far from over. Jake's emergency leave couldn't come fast enough. The 2-week journey back to the States felt like the longest trip of his life. Every hour that passed meant more construction happening on his stolen land. By the time he finally made it home, the foundation was complete, and they were already starting to frame the walls of what would become someone else's house. Standing at the edge of his property, or what used to be his property, Jake felt like he was looking at a crime scene. The peaceful spot where he used to sit and plan his future home was now a muddy construction site filled with trucks and workers who barely looked up when he approached. When he tried to talk to the foreman, the man just shrugged and said he was doing his job, building a house for Pinnacle Development Corporation. "This is my land," Jake told him, his voice tight with anger. The foreman, a weathered guy in his 50s, actually looked sympathetic. "Look, soldier, I don't know anything about that. All I know is my company got hired to build a house here and we got all the proper permits. You got a problem. You need to talk to the people who hired us." That's when Jake started digging deeper, and what he found made his blood boil. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowner Association wasn't just some normal neighborhood group trying to keep property values up. It was something much more sinister. Jake spent hours at the county courthouse going through public records with Mr. Peterson. What they discovered was a pattern that made Jake sick to his stomach. He wasn't the first military member to lose property this way. In fact, over the past 3 years, the HOA had seized and sold 3 different properties belonging to deployed service members. The first was a Navy petty officer named Lisa, who had been stationed in Japan. She owned a corner lot that was perfect for commercial development. While she was overseas, the HOA claimed she owed $1,200 in fees and late charges. They sold her property to Pinnacle Development for $60,000, about a third of its actual value. By the time Lisa found out, there was already a small shopping center being built there. The second victim was an Army captain named David, whose family had owned a large lot for over 20 years. When David got deployed to Iraq, the HOA suddenly decided his property violated some obscure landscaping rule. They imposed massive fines that quickly grew into thousands of dollars with penalties and interest. His property was sold while he was in a combat zone, unable to defend himself or even know what was happening. Now Jake was victim number 3, and the pattern was becoming clear. The HOA specifically targeted military families when they were deployed and couldn't fight back. They would wait until someone left for overseas duty, then suddenly discover violations or impose fees that the service member had never heard of. But here's where it got really dirty. Jake discovered that the president of the HOA, a man named Dale Hutchinson, was also the majority owner of Pinnacle Development Corporation, the same company that kept buying all these properties at bargain prices. Hutchinson was literally stealing land from deployed soldiers and selling it to himself. The more Jake learned about Hutchinson, the angrier he got. This guy lived in a massive house on the other side of the subdivision, drove expensive cars, and apparently made his money by taking advantage of people who were serving their country. He had turned the HOA into his personal money-making machine, using legal loopholes and the service member's absence to steal their property. Jake tried going to the local police first, thinking this was obviously fraud. But Detective Rodriguez, at the sheriff's department, just shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry, son, but this looks like a civil matter to me. The HOA followed the legal process, even if it stinks morally. You need to handle this through the courts, not through us." The district attorney's office was even less helpful. The assistant DA, a tired-looking woman who seemed to have heard this story before, explained that property disputes were outside their usual scope. "These HOA cases are complicated," she said. "Even if there was wrongdoing, proving criminal intent is really difficult. Your best bet is to sue them in civil court." But Jake knew that civil court could take years and cost more money than he had. Meanwhile, his property was being developed, and every day that passed made it harder to get it back. The legal system seemed designed to protect people like Hutchinson, rather than victims like him. That's when Jake started reaching out to other people in the neighborhood, trying to find allies. What he discovered was that most residents were actually afraid of the HOA. They had seen what happened to people who challenged Hutchinson's authority, and they didn't want to become targets themselves. But not everyone was intimidated. Jake found an unexpected ally in Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA existed. She had been watching Hutchinson's schemes for years and was disgusted by what she saw. "That man is a bully and a thief," she told Jake over coffee in her kitchen. "He's been targeting military families because he knows they can't fight back when they're deployed. I've been keeping records of everything I've seen, but I'm just one old lady. Nobody listens to me." Mrs. Chen showed Jake a thick folder filled with newspaper clippings, photos, and notes she had been collecting. She had documented every questionable sale, every suspicious fee, every time the HOA had bent the rules to benefit Hutchinson's company. It was like she had been building a case for years, just waiting for someone to help her use it. Jake also connected with Tom, a local handyman who had worked on several properties in the neighborhood. Tom had seen the pattern too and was willing to talk about what he knew. "I've done work for Pinnacle Development," he said quietly, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "The things I've heard in those meetings would make your head spin. They specifically look for deployed military members because they know those people can't respond to legal notices or show up to hearings." The more people Jake talked to, the clearer the picture became. Hutchinson had created a system that was technically legal but completely corrupt. He would impose fees or fines on deployed service members, send notices to addresses where he knew nobody was checking mail, then quickly move through the foreclosure process before anyone could stop him. The worst part was how he had corrupted the local legal system to help him. The lawyer who handled all the foreclosure paperwork, Mr. Williams, happened to be Hutchinson's golf buddy and business partner in other ventures. The county clerk who processed all the sales, Janet Morrison, had received several gifts from Hutchinson over the years, including a new car that was supposedly won in a contest. Jake realized he was fighting more than just one crooked HOA president. He was up against an entire network of corruption that included lawyers, government officials, and business partners who all benefited from stealing from deployed military members. The local authorities either couldn't or wouldn't help him because too many people had their hands in the cookie jar. But Jake had something that Hutchinson probably hadn't counted on. He was a soldier who had been trained to never give up, even when the odds seemed impossible. And he was starting to realize that maybe he didn't need to fight this battle alone. Maybe it was time to call in some bigger guns. Jake knew he was out of his depth fighting this alone. The local system was either corrupt or too scared to take on Hutchinson's network. But Jake had one advantage that the HOA president probably hadn't thought about. He was still an active duty soldier, and the military takes care of its own. Back at the base, Jake went straight to the legal assistance office. Captain Johnson, the base's legal officer, had handled plenty of deployment issues before. But when Jake explained what had happened, her expression grew darker with every detail. "Wait, let me get this straight," she said, leaning forward in her chair. "They foreclosed on your property while you were deployed without verifying your military status and sold it to a company owned by the HOA president who imposed the fees in the first place." "That's exactly what happened," Jake replied. "And I found out I'm not the first one. They've been doing this to deployed soldiers for years." Captain Johnson was quiet for a long moment, then picked up her phone. "I need to make some calls." "What you're describing isn't just theft. It's a federal crime. There are specific laws that protect military members from exactly this kind of situation." She explained something called the Service Members Civil Relief Act, or SCRA. Jake had heard of it but never really understood how powerful it was. Basically, it makes it illegal to foreclose on a service member's property while they're on active duty without getting permission from a federal court first. And that permission is almost never granted, especially for someone deployed in a combat zone. The fact that they didn't even check your military status before proceeding with the foreclosure is a huge red flag, Captain Johnson said. Either they were incredibly incompetent, or they knew exactly what they were doing and thought they could get away with it. Within hours, Captain Johnson had connected Jake with Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the base's top legal officer. Colonel Hawkins was a tough woman in her 50s who had built her career on protecting soldiers' rights. When she heard Jake's story, she didn't just get angry. She got focused in a way that made Jake think someone was about to have a very bad day. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, "what happened to you is not just wrong, it's a federal crime. And if they're systematically targeting deployed service members like you described, we're looking at a conspiracy that goes way beyond simple property theft." Colonel Hawkins immediately contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office. Unlike the local district attorney who had brushed Jake off, the federal prosecutors were very interested in what they heard. Federal crimes against military members were taken seriously, especially when they involved mail fraud, wire fraud, and civil rights violations. While the legal wheels started turning, Jake decided to try another approach. Mrs. Chen had mentioned a local newspaper reporter who had been asking questions about HOA corruption. Her name was Amanda Rodriguez, and she worked for the regional paper that covered several counties. Jake met Amanda at a coffee shop downtown, and he could tell right away that she was the kind of journalist who didn't give up easily. She had been tracking HOA abuse stories for months, but nothing as systematic as what Jake was describing. "I've heard rumors about Willowbrook Estates," she said, pulling out a thick notebook. "But I could never get anyone to go on record. Most people are too afraid of retaliation from the HOA." Jake told her everything: the pattern of targeting military families, the connection between Hutchinson and Pinnacle Development, the corrupt local officials who helped process the illegal sales. Amanda's eyes lit up as she took notes. "This is bigger than I thought," she said. "If I can verify everything you're telling me, this could be a front-page story. But I need documentation, public records, and preferably more victims willing to talk." Jake put Amanda in touch with Mrs. Chen, who had been waiting years for someone to pay attention to her evidence. He also helped her connect with Lisa and David, the other military members who had lost their properties. At first, they were hesitant to speak publicly, but when Amanda explained how their stories could help protect other service members, they agreed to cooperate. The newspaper investigation moved fast. Amanda was good at her job, and she had sources throughout the county government who helped her dig up records that showed the full scope of the corruption. She discovered that Hutchinson's network had stolen nearly $500,000 worth of property from military families over 3 years. But the real breakthrough came when Amanda found out about the money trail. All those bargain price property sales hadn't just benefited Pinnacle Development, they had generated kickbacks to several local officials who had helped make the sales happen. The county clerk who processed the paperwork had received cash payments. The lawyer who handled the foreclosures had been given a partnership stake in one of Hutchinson's other businesses. When Amanda's story hit the front page, it created exactly the kind of public outrage that politicians notice. The headline read, "Local HOA targets deployed soldiers, steals land while they serve overseas." The story included photos of Jake's destroyed property, interviews with all 3 military victims, and detailed documentation of the corruption network. The public reaction was immediate and intense. People were furious that someone would take advantage of deployed soldiers. Veterans groups started organizing protests. Local talk radio shows spent hours discussing the story. Social media exploded with people sharing the article and demanding justice. But the person who really made a difference was Congressman Robert Sterling, a Navy veteran who represented the district where Willowbrook Estates was located. Sterling had been looking for ways to strengthen protections for military families, and Jake's case gave him the perfect example of why new laws were needed. Sterling's office contacted Jake within hours of the story being published. His chief of staff, a former Marine named Kevin Park, explained that the congressman wanted to hold congressional hearings about HOA abuse of military families. "This is exactly the kind of issue the congressman cares about," Kevin said. "He's been pushing for stronger enforcement of military protection laws, and your case shows why that's so important." The congressional attention changed everything. Suddenly, the U.S. Attorney's Office wasn't just interested, they were actively investigating. FBI agents started showing up at the courthouse, requesting records and interviewing people connected to the HOA. Federal investigators began looking into Hutchinson's business dealings, his bank accounts, and his connections to local officials. Jake felt like he was watching dominoes fall. Every day brought new developments as the investigation grew bigger. The county clerk suddenly took early retirement. The lawyer who had handled the foreclosures started cooperating with federal investigators. Several HOA board members resigned and hired criminal defense attorneys. But Hutchinson wasn't going down without a fight. He hired an expensive legal team and started making public statements claiming he was being unfairly targeted. He said the foreclosures were completely legal and that he had followed all proper procedures. That's when Colonel Hawkins called Jake with news that made him smile for the first time in months. The military legal investigation had uncovered something that changed the entire game, something that would give the federal government power that Hutchinson had never imagined. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, "we found something very interesting in the old land records. It turns out the government has some rights regarding your subdivision that nobody has been paying attention to. Rights that we're about to exercise." Jake could hear the satisfaction in her voice, and he knew that Hutchinson was about to learn what happens when you mess with the United States military. Jake had never seen Colonel Hawkins smile like that before. There was something almost predatory about the way she looked as she spread out a stack of old documents across her desk. These weren't recent papers. Some of them looked like they were from decades ago, with yellowed edges and faded government seals. "Sergeant Thompson, do you know what eminent domain is?" she asked, her fingers drumming on the desk. Jake had heard the term but wasn't exactly sure what it meant. Something about the government taking private property? Exactly. The government can take private property for public use, as long as they pay fair market value. But here's the interesting part. Sometimes the government already has rights to property that people have forgotten about. She pulled out a map that showed the entire Willowbrook Estates area. "This land your subdivision sits on? It was designated for potential military use back in 1987. There's a federal easement that was never formally released." Jake stared at the map, trying to understand what this meant. So the government still has some kind of claim to the land? More than some kind of claim. We have legal rights that supersede all the property deeds in your neighborhood. Rights that we're about to exercise. Colonel Hawkins picked up her phone. "I'm calling the Department of Defense Real Estate Division. It's time to remind Mr. Hutchinson who he's really been messing with." What happened next moved faster than Jake could have imagined. Within 48 hours, federal marshals were serving legal papers throughout Willowbrook Estates. The documents informed every property owner that the United States government was exercising its right of eminent domain over the entire 847-home subdivision. The reason given was national security, specifically, the need to protect military personnel and their families from predatory practices that could affect military readiness. The government announced plans to convert the entire subdivision into military family housing, offering current residents the choice to sell at fair market value or face mandatory buyout procedures. Jake was at the courthouse when Hutchinson first learned about the federal action. The man who had seemed so confident and untouchable just days before looked like he had been hit by a truck. His expensive lawyer was frantically making phone calls, trying to find someone who could stop what was happening. "This is impossible," Hutchinson kept saying. "They can't just take an entire neighborhood. This is America, not some communist country." But they could, and they were. The federal government's lawyers had done their homework. The old military easement was completely legal and had never been properly released. More importantly, the systematic targeting of deployed service members had created a national security issue that justified the government's action. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved just as quickly on the criminal side. Jake watched with satisfaction as FBI agents arrested Hutchinson at his office, along with the corrupt lawyer Williams and County Clerk Morrison. The charges were serious: conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, and violating the civil rights of service members. But the arrests were just the beginning. Federal investigators had been digging deep into Hutchinson's financial records, and what they found was even worse than anyone had imagined. The property theft scheme had generated over $400,000 in illegal profits. Hutchinson had used that money to buy luxury cars, take expensive vacations, and even purchase a second home in Florida. All of those assets were immediately frozen by federal court order. Hutchinson's bank accounts, his cars, his houses, even his golf club membership. Everything was seized as evidence and potential restitution for his victims. The impact on the neighborhood was immediate and dramatic. Property values in Willowbrook Estates collapsed overnight as news of the federal takeover spread. Residents who had paid premium prices for their homes suddenly found themselves in a neighborhood that was about to become government property. Most residents were angry, but not at Jake or the other military victims. They were furious at Hutchinson for bringing this disaster down on their community. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down from where Jake's property used to be, stopped him at the grocery store to apologize. "I'm so sorry about what happened to you," she said, tears in her eyes. "I had no idea that man was stealing from soldiers. If I had known, I would have done something to stop it." Jake appreciated her words, but he also understood her position. You couldn't have known how bad it was. Hutchinson was good at hiding what he was doing. The federal buyout process was surprisingly fair and efficient. Government appraisers came through the neighborhood, assessing each property at current market value, the value before news of the takeover had crashed prices. Most residents were offered more money than they could get by trying to sell their homes privately in the current situation. Some residents tried to fight the takeover in court, but their lawyers quickly explained that fighting the federal government on eminent domain was almost impossible, especially when national security was involved. The government had followed all the proper legal procedures, and the military easement gave them unquestionable rights to the land. Jake found himself in an unusual position. While his neighbors were being forced to sell their homes, he was getting his stolen property back, along with substantial damages for what had been done to it. The federal court had voided all of Hutchinson's illegal property sales, returning the land to its rightful owners and ordering compensation for any damage or development that had occurred. The half-built house on Jake's property was torn down at government expense. The concrete foundation was removed, the land was restored to its natural state, and Jake was paid for all the trees that had been cut down and the creek that had been damaged. He received enough money to not only rebuild exactly what he had lost, but to build something even better. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Jake learned what was happening to Hutchinson's own house. The massive mansion where the HOA president had lived while stealing from military families was being converted into the headquarters for a new military family legal assistance program. Jake would be working there part-time, helping other service members protect themselves from similar schemes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had gotten rich by taking advantage of deployed soldiers would now see his former home used to protect those same soldiers from people like him. Amanda Rodriguez wrote a follow-up story about the military's response that made national news. The headline read, "Military takes over entire subdivision after HOA targets deployed soldiers." The story was picked up by news outlets across the country, and Jake found himself doing interviews on television and radio shows. "How does it feel to see the military take over the neighborhood where you were robbed?" one reporter asked him. Jake thought about that question for a moment before answering. "It feels like justice, not just for me but for Lisa and David and any other military family that might have been targeted in the future. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them there are consequences for their actions." The federal takeover sent shockwaves through HOA communities nationwide. Lawyers who specialized in HOA law were suddenly getting calls from worried board members asking if their associations could face similar action. The message was clear. Targeting military families was no longer a low-risk, high-reward scheme. But Jake knew this was bigger than just one corrupt HOA. This was about respect for the people who serve their country and protection for military families who sacrifice so much. The military had sent a message that would be remembered for years to come. Mess with our soldiers, and you mess with all of us. The day of Hutchinson's sentencing was one Jake had been waiting for since he first saw those pictures of his destroyed land. The federal courthouse was packed with people, military families, veterans, residents from Willowbrook Estates, and reporters from newspapers and TV stations across the country. This case had become much bigger than just one stolen property. Jake sat in the front row, wearing his dress uniform, flanked by Lisa and David, the other two military victims who had lost their properties to Hutchinson's scheme. Behind them sat dozens of other service members who had come to show support and witness justice being served. Judge Richardson had a reputation for being tough on people who took advantage of military families. He was a Vietnam veteran himself, and when he looked down at Hutchinson from the bench, his expression left no doubt about how he felt about what had happened. "Mr. Hutchinson," the judge began, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, "in my 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated and cruel scheme to target the very people who sacrifice the most for our country. You didn't just steal property. You stole dreams, security, and peace of mind from families who were already giving everything to serve America." Hutchinson's lawyer had tried to argue for leniency, claiming his client was a respected businessman who had made some poor decisions, but the evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had found detailed records showing that Hutchinson had specifically researched deployment schedules to target military families when they were most vulnerable. 8 years in federal prison, Judge Richardson announced. "And I want to be clear. You will serve every day of that sentence. There will be no early release, no comfortable minimum security facility. You targeted our nation's defenders, and you will face the full consequences of your actions." The courtroom erupted in applause, and Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he had been carrying for over a year. But Hutchinson wasn't the only one facing justice that day. Williams, the corrupt lawyer who had rubber-stamped all the illegal foreclosures, received 5 years in federal prison and was permanently disbarred. Morrison, the county clerk who had processed the fraudulent sales, got 3 years and lost her government pension. Several HOA board members who had helped cover up the scheme received shorter sentences and hefty fines. But the real satisfaction came from watching all of Hutchinson's stolen wealth being redistributed to his victims. The federal court had ordered complete restitution, which meant Jake, Lisa, and David each received substantial financial settlements. Jake's settlement was enough to not only rebuild his dream house, but to start the nonprofit organization he had been planning. 6 months later, Jake stood on his restored property watching construction crews work on his new home. But this wasn't the same simple house he had originally planned. The government compensation had allowed him to build something special, a house designed specifically for a veteran with space for a home office where he could help other military families. The land looked better than it ever had before. The government restoration project had not only replaced the trees that Hutchinson's people had cut down, but had planted even more. The creek was cleaner than before, and the entire area had been turned into a small nature preserve that was open to all the military families in the new community. Because that's what Willowbrook Estates had become, a thriving military family housing community. The houses that had once been owned by wealthy civilians were now home to sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and their families. The neighborhood had a completely different feel now, with kids playing in yards while their parents deployed overseas, knowing their community would take care of them. Jake's new job was based in Hutchinson's former mansion, which had been converted into the Military Family Legal Protection Center. Walking into that building every day was a constant reminder of how far things had come. The same office where Hutchinson had once planned his schemes against military families was now dedicated to protecting those families. The center had already helped dozens of military families across the country who were facing similar problems, with corrupt HOAs, predatory lenders, and other scams targeting deployed service members. Jake worked there part-time while finishing his military service, using his experience to help other soldiers navigate legal problems. The thing people don't understand, Jake explained to a new client, a young Marine whose apartment complex was trying to break his lease while he was deployed, is that there are laws specifically designed to protect us. You just have to know how to use them, and you have to be willing to fight. The legal center had become a model for other communities. Congressman Sterling had secured federal funding to expand the program to military bases across the country. The success of Jake's case had led to new legislation strengthening protections for military families and increasing penalties for people who tried to take advantage of deployed service members. Jake also received a promotion to Sergeant First class and a commendation for his role in exposing the corruption and protecting military families. But the recognition that meant the most to him came from the letters he received from other service members who had heard his story. One letter was from a soldier in Germany whose HOA had tried to impose illegal fees while he was overseas. After reading about Jake's case, the soldier contacted the legal center and was able to stop the scheme before losing his property. Another letter came from a Navy family in California who used the precedent from Jake's case to fight a predatory lender trying to foreclose on their home. Lisa had used her settlement money to go back to school and become a lawyer herself, specializing in military family law. David had started a nonprofit organization that helped veterans with housing issues. All three of them regularly spoke at military bases, warning service members about the scams they might face and teaching them how to protect themselves. The impact went far beyond just helping individual families. HOA corruption schemes targeting military families dropped dramatically nationwide after Jake's case made headlines. Lawyers who had been making money from these scams suddenly found themselves being investigated by federal authorities. County clerks and other officials became much more careful about processing property sales involving military families. Amanda Rodriguez won a National Journalism Award for her investigation of the Hutchinson scheme. Her follow-up stories tracked similar corruption in other states and helped expose a network of predators who had been targeting military families across the country. But perhaps the most important change was in how military families saw their own power to fight back. For too long, service members had accepted that deployment meant being vulnerable to scams and legal problems back home. Jake's case showed that the military would stand behind its people when they were wronged. 3 years after it all started, Jake stood in the same spot where he had once planned to build his workshop. But instead of a workshop, there was now a small amphitheater where the military community held outdoor events and ceremonies. As he watched military families enjoying a summer barbecue, their children playing safely while parents shared stories and supported each other, Jake realized this had turned out better than anything he had originally imagined. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen, who had moved to a retirement community but stayed in touch. Saw the news story about your program helping that family in Texas. Dale would be rolling over in his cell if he knew his mansion was being used to protect the people he tried to hurt. Jake smiled and typed back, Justice has a sense of humor sometimes. He had learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to you can lead to the best outcomes, not just for yourself but for others who need help. What started as one soldier's fight to get his land back had become a movement that protected military families across the entire country. And that was worth more than any piece of property could ever be.